Hi everyone. In a small town in America, there was a church that served as the center of life for most of its residents. Reverend Thomas, a middle-aged man with a face that was always calm and full of wisdom, was the leader of the church. For over 2 decades, he was known as a knowledgeable, dedicated figure who was deeply respected by his congregation. From the church pulpit, he eloquently taught Paul's teachings about Jesus being worshipped as God and the forgiveness of sins through his cross. The church members were always inspired by his sermons, and many felt that their lives had changed thanks to Thomas's guidance. However, despite appearing perfect on the outside, there was an unease that continually troubled Thomas's mind. Occasionally, when standing before the congregation, he felt an emptiness he could not fill, a feeling that grew day by day, a doubt that suddenly appeared, eroding the peace he had always prided himself on. Every time he read the Bible, every time he preached about Jesus as God, a part of him felt something was wrong. He often wondered if the teachings he had received and preached were truly in line with the real message of Jesus. He knew that Jesus had never taught the doctrine of the Trinity, but that was the doctrine emphasized by Paul and the one he had conveyed to his congregation. This darkness deepened one night after a service when Thomas walked alone through the churchyard. The night was so quiet, with only the soft sound of the wind blowing. Under the moonlight, he sat on a wooden bench and closed his eyes. The eerie and silent atmosphere made his heart grow more uncertain. What exactly had Jesus taught? How could the Trinity, such a complex concept, be at the core of Christian teachings when Jesus himself always emphasized the oneness of God? That sense of unease began to gnaw at him. He knew he could no longer live his life simply by following established traditions without truly understanding the deeper truth. Thomas started to feel trapped in a lie, not only to his congregation but also to himself. He felt he had to find the answer, even if it meant delving deeper into an unexpected mystery. The next day, Thomas sat in his private room behind the church. On the table were various copies of the Bible he had long read, but that night, he opened an old Bible that had been neglected for years, an old copy passed down by a friend who had passed away several years ago. He vividly remembered his friend, who always spoke about seeking the truth beyond the boundaries of existing teachings. Perhaps that was what he was truly searching for, a truth greater than what he had learned all this time. He began to read attentively, trying to find clues hidden in every word and sentence. He read about Jesus teaching love, justice, and peace, and how he always emphasized that there is only one God to be worshipped. Without realizing it, the night grew late, and the candlelight illuminating his desk began to dim. Anxiously, Thomas began to doubt the teachings he had always believed in. How could the doctrine of the Trinity, a concept of God divided into 3, be the foundation of their faith when Jesus himself had never taught this? Why was Paul's doctrine so dominant, while the true teachings of Jesus seemed to be neglected? These thoughts increasingly troubled Thomas. He felt as though his whole life had been built on a fragile foundation. What he had taught, what he had conveyed to his congregation, was it truly in line with God's will? Every time he remembered the hopeful faces of his congregation, he felt more trapped. But that very night, as he reflected in the darkness, he felt something pushing him to search further, to dig deeper. He sensed a brighter path, though he didn't yet know what it was. On this journey, he did not know that his search would lead him to an unexpected truth, a truth he had long been hiding from himself. The road, filled with confusion, doubt, and wonder, had just begun. Little did Thomas know his search would change his life forever. This is where it all began. a journey that would lead Thomas to a new understanding of God, Jesus, and himself. And that journey would ultimately lead Thomas to a decision that would shake the church he served. That morning, Thomas woke up with a mind still filled with doubt. His search the night before made him feel as though he had discovered a new path, even though he didn't yet know where it would lead. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, now seemed blurry and full of questions. After praying with a heart full of concern, he decided to take a further step. The old Bible he had found the night before was still lying on the table, and although he felt uncertain, this time he took a bold step to dig deeper. As he flipped through the pages, he began to look for passages that spoke of Jesus' life, his teachings that were simple yet profound, teachings that always spoke of love, justice, and the oneness of God. But something deeper caught Thomas's attention. In reading certain parts, he noticed something striking. There were many differences between what Jesus taught and what Paul taught. Paul often emphasized that Jesus was God, yet Jesus himself never said this. In the Gospels, Jesus never spoke of himself as God to be worshipped, but rather as a messenger of God who brought peace and love to humanity. Thomas felt as though he had discovered something he had long overlooked, a significant gap between the teachings that truly came from Jesus and those that had developed within the church. The anxiety deepened as he read more about the teachings of the one true God, which were mentioned in many parts of the Bible. This teaching, which reminded Thomas of the concept of the oneness of God found in other monotheistic religions, began to raise even bigger questions. Why had the concept of the Trinity, God existing in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, become the core teaching of the Church, if Jesus himself had never taught this? After days of searching for answers, Thomas found himself at a crossroads. He felt there was a greater truth than what he had been teaching all these years. He felt that God, in his essence, was only one, and that Jesus was merely his messenger. The doctrine of the Trinity and the worship of Jesus as God, he believed, seemed like a human construct that did not align with the original teachings of Jesus. However, Thomas's search did not stop there. As he continued reading, he felt something more compelling catch his attention, a teaching coming from outside the church tradition. In various discussions he attended and books he read, he began to explore the teachings of Islam. Though he knew little about the religion, he was drawn to its simplicity in explaining the concept of the one true God, who was not divided into three persons. Islam, in its teachings, affirms that God is one without partners. This concept was very close to what Thomas believed about Jesus' teachings, which always emphasized that there is only one God to be worshipped. Thomas was surprised by the many similarities between the values found in Islamic teachings and the teachings of Jesus that he understood. Islam teaches peace, love, justice, and respect for others, values that were also present in Jesus' teachings. One meeting that changed everything occurred when Thomas met a scholar of Islam who had once been part of the Christian community. This person spoke about how he found deeper peace after embracing Islam. He shared how the teachings of Islam emphasized submission to the one true God, Tawhid, which reminded Thomas of Jesus' teachings about loving God with all your heart. That conversation became a turning point for Thomas. For the first time, he felt there was a clear path ahead of him. The search that had previously felt dark and confusing now began to seem clearer. Thomas felt that Islam offered the peace he had been seeking, a peace that came from the simplicity of understanding God, and a peace found in the belief in the oneness of God. On one hand, Thomas was frightened. He knew that diving into this truth meant leaving behind the life he had built in the church. But on the other hand, he felt he could no longer deny what he had discovered. The truth he had been seeking all this time, about the one true God, about the true teachings of Jesus, felt closer than ever before. Thomas spent days reflecting, praying, and writing in his personal journal. Every night, he read more deeply about Islam, finding many similarities between the teachings of Jesus and those found in the Quran. Over time, he became more convinced that the truth he sought was not something that came from the teachings he had followed all this time, but something much deeper and more authentic. These thoughts consumed him. He felt that he could no longer live in confusion. He knew that one day he would have to make a decision that would shake the world he had known all his life. But he also knew that this path was the only one that could give him true peace. On a bright morning, with the fresh air enveloping the small church where Thomas served, the tension that had long troubled his mind had now reached its peak. He could no longer hold back the unease that had gripped his heart. A big decision had emerged in his mind. Thomas knew this was a defining moment, one that would change his life and the lives of the congregation he had dedicated himself to for so many years. That day, the church looked as usual, filled with congregation members coming to worship. However, something was different. The congregation did not know what was about to happen, but Thomas could feel that this would be a service they would never forget. When the sermon began, Thomas stood at the pulpit, his eyes scanning the congregation, all of whom were listening attentively. Though his face appeared calm, there was a tension he could not hide. Thomas began speaking in a voice lower than usual. He opened the Bible, but this time not to read the verses he had often shared with his congregation. Instead, he opened passages that spoke of Jesus, who taught love, peace, and the oneness of God. His voice echoed in the quiet church, but there was something different in the tone. He spoke with a newfound conviction, a conviction that had come after a long journey of spiritual searching. My brothers and sisters, we have walked this life together, serving God, but I feel that something is wrong with the teachings we have received. We have been guided by teachings greatly influenced by Paul, who spoke a lot about the Trinity and the worship of Jesus as God. But is this truly what Jesus taught? The atmosphere in the church became tense. The congregation exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. Thomas continued, I have studied more deeply, and I have found a truth that has been hidden from us all this time. Jesus taught that God is one, not divided into three. Jesus came to show us the way of peace and love, not to establish dogmas that divide us. His eyes locked with the congregation, full of certainty, but also with a heavy burden. I feel that we have been deceived. I feel as though I have taught something that is not entirely true, something that does not align with the true teachings of Jesus. And for that, I apologize. I have searched, I have studied, and I feel that I have found the true truth. The congregation grew uneasy. Some were anxious, unsure if this was just a regular sermon or if something bigger was happening. Thomas took a deep breath and then spoke more firmly. I have found that truth in Islam. The teachings of Islam speak of the one true God, the oneness of God, which is at the core of Jesus' teachings. Islam teaches peace, compassion, and a better life for all of us. A tense silence enveloped the church. The congregation began to whisper, some looking confused, while others began to feel the same unease Thomas had felt. But Thomas knew that this was the step he had to take. With a steady step, he approached the table next to the pulpit. There lay many copies of the Bible that had long been his guide, the one he had taught to the congregation. Thomas took each Bible one by one and, with a heart full of conviction, placed them on the fire that had been prepared outside the church. Thick black smoke began to rise into the air. The fire quickly consumed the Bibles, and in front of the shocked congregation, a large symbol burned, a symbol of inevitable change. Thomas stood tall, watching the fire, as though he were also burning his doubts, guilt, and the uncertainty that had always plagued his heart. "This is a symbol of our liberation," Thomas said with a voice full of conviction. "We are no longer bound by the teachings that mislead us. We are no longer trapped in the lies that have been taught to us. Now is the time for us to seek the true truth." The congregation was stunned. Some were crying, others were silent, while others were confused. No one had expected that today they would witness something so radical. However, despite the mixed emotions, some began to feel drawn to Thomas's words. Some started to open their hearts, sensing there was something deeper in the teachings he had revealed. Thomas continued, "I don't want you to follow me because I am your pastor. I want you to seek this truth for yourselves. If you feel like I do, if you also feel that something is wrong, then I invite you to study the teachings of Islam with me, to see the truth that has been hidden all this time." With confident steps, Thomas left the church, leaving behind a congregation in silence. Some began discussing with each other, moved to study more deeply, while others remained silent, feeling the weight of the change that had just occurred. But for Thomas, that decision was liberation. Liberation from the doubts that had haunted him, and liberation from the teachings he had followed but never truly found peace in. Now he felt closer to the truth he had been seeking all along, and his journey had just begun. After that dramatic event, the church where Thomas had served was never the same again. The news of what happened that day quickly spread throughout the town. Some people began visiting the church, wondering about the reason behind the drastic decision Thomas had made. Many were confused, some even angry, but there were also those who were curious about what he had to say. However, for Thomas, that day marked the beginning of a long journey, far greater than anything he had ever imagined. In the following weeks, Thomas not only spent his time reflecting, but also delved deeper into the teachings of Islam. He read more about the concept of Tawhid, the clear and firm belief in the oneness of God, without the confusion or complexity that had always existed in the doctrine of the Trinity. In the Quran, he found many similarities with the teachings of Jesus, especially in terms of love, justice, and the importance of peace. Thomas felt as if he had just opened his eyes. Every day, he became more certain that the path he had chosen was the right one. He felt a peace he had never experienced before. His heart and soul were now filled with a clearer understanding of God, the world, and the purpose of life. He felt as though he had rediscovered his path to the one true God, after years of being in unresolved confusion. However, the major decision he made was not easily accepted by everyone. The church, which had been the place where he served, now began to crack. Some of the congregation felt offended and deceived, considering him a traitor. They viewed Thomas's actions as an insult to the Christian teachings they had long upheld. Some who had once followed Thomas began to distance themselves, afraid of the consequences that might arise. The news of the Bible burning still haunted them. However, there were also those who were moved by the change in Thomas. Some members of the congregation, who had been doubtful about the teachings they had received, began to approach him. They wanted to know more, to seek the truth that Thomas had found. They began to discuss, read deeper, and ask about Islam. Over time, more and more joined Thomas on this spiritual journey. They felt that Islam offered something greater and clearer, something that answered the doubts that had long been in their hearts. One afternoon, after months full of questions and searching, Thomas invited those who felt moved to join him. In a simple room that had once been used for church meetings, they gathered. Thomas stood before them, with a heart full of hope and peace. "My brothers, we are all here because we feel that we have found the true truth. We have gone through a long road full of doubts and confusion. But now we are at the point where we can feel the peace that comes from the one true God, Allah, the one without any partners. We are no longer bound by misleading dogmas. We are now free to follow the path shown by Prophet Muhammad and the pure teachings of Islam." Thomas spoke with conviction, and the congregation there listened attentively. Some of them began to feel the same call. After the meeting, one by one, they began to recite the Shahada, the declaration that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. This great decision was made with sincere hearts, acknowledging the truth they had long sought, and freeing themselves from all their confusion. That day became an extraordinary turning point, not only for Thomas but also for the congregation that had faithfully accompanied him. Those who had once been part of that church, who were burned by questions and the search for truth, now entered into a new life, a life in the light of Islam. After that event, Thomas decided to leave the church and all the ties that had bound him. However, he felt free to follow the truth he had found, free to live according to the teachings he believed in, and free to teach that truth to others. He knew that this path would not be easy, but he also knew that he was no longer alone. Together with the congregation, who were now his fellow believers, they were ready to embark on this new journey, with full conviction that they had found the straight path. Now, Thomas was no longer a Christian pastor. He was a Muslim, and his life journey, full of searching, doubts, and ultimately enlightenment, would continue to inspire many. With the courage to seek the truth and to make bold decisions, Thomas and his congregation began a new life, holding on to the belief they considered to be the true truth. That change did not only occur in him and his congregation, but it also began to inspire those around them. Although this journey was full of challenges, Thomas believed that the truth would always find its way, and that Allah would always guide his servants who seek sincerely.